I know we've heard of many different styles and setup in the box. Today, I'm going to take you through some of those styles, as well as other things throughout the hitter's process in the swing. I'm James Rowson, and I look forward to taking you guys through that process. So let's get started with getting into the batter's box. To start from square one, the first thing a hitter does is he can be in the front of the box, he could be in the middle of the box, or he can be in the back of the box. Most time that's going to deal with the comfort level of the hitter. The one thing in that setup that I would like the hitter to always be aware of is making sure in his setup, regardless of where he stands, that he has coverage of the plate. So the first thing is making sure that we have plate coverage, meaning that the barrel of my bat can cover the outside corner or the outside half of home plate. You see a lot of young hitters, you see a lot of professional hitters at times, they don't get to the point where they have that coverage, which can directly lead to different issues throughout the swing. It can lead to not being able to handle a pitch that's out over the plate, which can also force you to try to make some mechanical adjustments that you probably don't need to make. So plate coverage is very, very important in the setup. Again, if I'm a guy who's going to start a little more toward the front, I still want to make sure I have that coverage, middle or the back of the box. So the concerns and where you stand in the box will deal with ultimately your setup, but it will also deal with making sure you have coverage of the plate, number one. Once you get to that point where you feel comfortable and you have that plate coverage, we want to talk about just the setup of, let's just start with the lower half. You see many stances. You see stances where guys are square. You'll see a stance where guys can be closed off. And you also see what we call the open stance. At every level, all these stances work. There are hitters that are successful using all three of these stances. But there are some keys to these stances moving forward that every hitter must do in order to make sure that he's in a good position to allow this to work. So we'll start simply with the easiest of the three, and the most talked about would be the squared stance, which means your toes are fairly squared up, you know, maybe slightly front toe to the middle of the back foot, but not much more than that, which would be fairly square in your setup. I have my plate coverage to here. Now, once I'm in this position, and we're just talking about the lower half, the key to this is, if my legs are square, is that I keep my hips square as well. So I want to make sure that I have my feet squared up, my hips square, and this stance to start. At times you will see hitters where if your hips are not square from this stance, you can cause yourself to close off. If your hips are slightly open, you can cause yourself to open up, which will again then directly affect, if my hips are open, directly affect my plate coverage. If my hips are too closed off, it will directly affect my ability to get to the pitch inside. So it's very important throughout this process that if I'm square, my hips stay square, keeps everything lined up, allows me to get into the best position to hit the ball. That would be the squared setup with the lower half. The next deal would be the open setup with the lower half. When I'm opened up with my lower half, there are going to be different variations of where guys have this front foot. Some guys are more comfortable with the front foot slightly open while they're open. Other guys are open, yet they have their front foot squared off. Once again, from the open setup, regardless of where you do it, the key factor in this is making sure when you get ready to hit that you're able to make sure at some point your hips do get back to square. If you're open and you stride open, you still have to have the ability to control the hips to keep your hips square, which will make sure that you can consistently have the plate coverage that we talked about. The difference in setups and stances sometimes comes strictly from that, comes from a guy's lack of plate coverage if he gets into an open stance and does not know how to use that stance properly. Once again, from again being in an open stance as a hitter, if this is the way I'm going to go to the ball, it does a couple things for me in a positive way. It will help some hitters get better vision of the pitcher. They're opened up, their eyes, they got both eyes facing the pitcher. They got great vision to see the ball. Sometimes hitters are not as comfortable when they're squared up or closed off and they can't see as well, this would be one guy who may like an open stance, who may like to use an open stance. It'll help with vision. It helps you see the field better, keeps you in a more relaxed position. With this position here is where we want to be from the open side moving forward. Again, hips being the key factor in these different setups. And I mean, sometimes we talk about our feet. It's not very important to me that our feet are always square. Our feet are here. Our feet can be wherever they want. The key to hitting is making sure that once you land or once you get to that position, that the hips are squared up, not necessarily just the feet. So we want the hips to be squared up in these situations moving forward. The third of the three stances would be the closed stance. The closed stance would be when the front foot is well in front of the back foot, almost probably heel to toe or more. If you get to that position, you consider yourself in a closed stance. Again, in this stance, the same rules apply. There are some guys that are going to be closed off a little differently. I'm not very concerned about what happens on the front foot in this area. I'm more concerned about the hips. Closed stance guys will tend to, at times, close off their upper body. Have to be sure that the upper body doesn't close off, because that'll directly affect, once again, my ability to have the plate coverage that I want and to be square. The key as a hitter is to maintain this plate coverage regardless of the stance I use. I want to maintain this. The best way to focus on that is focusing on my belt line staying square, my upper body staying square, where I can see the pitcher and still make the right move to the baseball. So those three setups would be, again, we'll go through them again. Square with the lower half, open with the lower half, or close with the lower half. Main focus, to keep the hips square at all times, regardless of the stance that you start with. Now that we've discussed the lower half, let's move to where we want and what the hands do in the setup. Again, just starting with the hands, simply we've heard different things about different grips. Obviously, the key grip has always been to have the knuckles lined up in the grip. You do see some players that have offset knuckles, where the knuckles are slightly offset. The bottom line is you want to make sure that your barrel can be squared up in a comfortable position to release the barrel through the zone. If your hands are cross-gripped too far, you're not able to do that with any type of consistency. So the key is to get to the grip to where it's comfortable, to where your barrel can do just this, release through the zone, and your grip would be pretty good. I would call your grip okay at that point. The setup of where the hands are going to be. The first thing is they need to be relaxed. You see some hitters that have their hands set up really high. You see some hitters that have their hands set up really low at the belt line. The bottom line is this is really not important. This is, as long as you can get to a good position on time, doesn't matter where they start. You'll find hitters will vary in that area. It's something to me that's not important. If there's a hitter that starts his hands low and can't get his hands to a good launch position on time, then that hitter may need to start his hands just a little bit higher in order to achieve the launch position at the right time. So the hand position is purely based on staying relaxed, staying loose, and getting your hands to the proper spot as the stride foot lands. If your hands are in a good position, about shoulder width, shoulder height on the back side, off the back shoulder a little bit, by the time the front foot lands, you're ready to launch. Your hands are in a good position. Your grip should be able to release, like we said, and that will vary player to player. And I think it's very important to kind of find out what zone you're in and where you feel most comfortable doing that. Now that we've got the lower half established, we've talked a little about the hands. Let's talk about probably the most important thing in the setup, which is your eyes and your vision. It's very important to make sure, regardless of the stance you're in, that you have your two eyes on the pitcher. You know, make sure there's binocular vision in this deal. Two eyes are always on the pitcher. There are times with some stances and some setups, you'll see the hitter start to lose vision from his back eye. Therefore, he's not seeing the pitcher well. He's not picking up the release point as well as he can. Also, if this head is turned this far, sometimes you end up putting your body in a bad position overall. So again, as long as 2 eyes are on the pitcher in your setup, regardless of square setup, I can turn my head and make sure 2 eyes are on the pitcher. Open, a lot easier. And the closed stance is where I really have to make sure, even though my lower half is closed off, that I still have 2 eyes on the pitcher at all times to make sure my head discipline is critical to all these things working. If your eyes aren't working, if your eyes aren't relaxed, if you don't have great vision, it's going to be very hard to be consistent at the plate.